Hello, and welcome to episode 28 of the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast. Hillary Schafer, Executive Director of the Jefferson Awards Foundation, based in Wilmington, Delaware, will be sharing with us today about board management and becoming a better nonprofit leader.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast, where your host, KIRSTEN BULLOCK, interviews nonprofit CEOs and executive directors who share what's working. Show notes can be found at nonprofitleadersnetwork.com. Please add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. Now, let's get on with the show.
Hi, Hillary. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Prior to joining the Jefferson Awards Foundation as Executive Director in September 2013, Hillary Schafer worked on Wall Street for 12 years. In her capacity as the head of U.S. institutional equity sales in New York for Citigroup, Hillary was one of the highest-ranking women in the equity business. From 1995 to 1999, Hillary was the Executive Director of Economic Security 2000, fighting to save and remodel Social Security. Hillary earned an MBA from Columbia Business School and a BA from Middlebury College. But one of the most important things, I think, to hear from people is what really brought them to the nonprofit world in the first place. So, Hillary, would you mind sharing a few words about that?
Sure. I think I found myself in the nonprofit world a little bit by accident. When I left Wall Street, I thought I would return to Wall Street. And when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, I got extremely involved in basically bringing warmth and security back to the hundreds of thousands of kids in New York whose lives had been upended by the hurricane. Coming out of that, I sort of shifted directions and decided I really wanted to have the opportunity to impact and benefit the lives of young people. I was on the board of the Jefferson Awards Foundation, and there was an opportunity to step in and really help restructure and reposition the organization to be in a major way ready to scale and impact, particularly the lives of young people. So I took on that challenge.
That's great. And you mentioned too that you had helped after Hurricane Sandy with your efforts on that. You helped to serve meals and get coats out to people, and you mentioned a couple numbers. Would you mind sharing those numbers again?
Sure. One of the benefits of having worked on Wall Street, and particularly in the equity business, was that I had access to sort of the top people at the major companies in this country who could provide resources to people who needed them. It was clear to me that there were significant needs in warm meals and warm coats and blankets to the millions of New Yorkers who'd lost those things and didn't have access to them. And so I basically started pulling together major programs and initiatives. In meals, we ended up serving a couple million warm meals, coats and blankets, a couple 100,000. In collaboration with some of the top nonprofits in the country, but really figuring out how to meet the needs in an immediate way.
That's fantastic. And so then you were able to bring what you had learned up to that point through your business work and through the volunteer work, and really focus it on the Jefferson Awards Foundation.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, the Jefferson Awards Foundation is an organization that was co-founded 44 years ago now by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, Senator Robert Taft, and my father, Sam Beard. So I'd been involved with it since birth, basically. I was on the board of the Jefferson Awards, and we had a terrific brand connected to celebration, reaching 100 million Americans, recognizing the very top change makers in our country over a 40-year period. We had all these amazing programs that we created where we power others to have maximum impact on the things they care about most in the world. And that organization really needed to be restructured and reorganized. And the board recognized that and asked if I would step in and really sort of lead that change. And that sounded like a terrific project for me.
Great. And coming from the corporate world into the nonprofit world, on one hand, you'd been around the nonprofit your whole life, but on the other hand, you were entering from a much different sector. Did you run into any surprises when you came in?
so many surprises. I think that, sort of on the not surprising side, running a major national nonprofit is complicated. And I knew it would be complicated. What surprised me was, I'd been in charge of really significant businesses on Wall Street, and it was hard. Running a nonprofit is much harder. What I think I misunderstood or hadn't really thought through is that when you run a nonprofit, you are effectively truly an entrepreneur. You are always at risk. You're at risk of your donors. You're at risk of timing of cash flow. You're at risk of not delivering your programs in the most high quality way that you can, and sort of making that mental shift from being an administrator inside a very large organization to being an entrepreneur is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that when you think about running a nonprofit, you think about the outputs and the outcomes and the impact that you can have in the world. And it's so satisfying and it's soul-filling work. But at the same time, it is so hard. And anybody who does social good knows that when you wake up every day, the things that define your day are challenges you need to overcome in order to be able to deliver those outcomes. Really being able to build a team around you of other nonprofit leaders, of your staff, of folks that can really sort of band together and overcome those challenges is a great need inside the nonprofit world.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're trying to overcome those challenges, do you ever lose sight of what the real impact is?
Every day. I find myself as executive director because if you think about it, my job is, strategic positioning, raising money, board management, all of those things which are big picture things. At the end of the day, what we really do is we change lives one by one. And for me, when I get stuck in sort of that, the maze of trying to navigate all those other things, I frequently will sit down with my staff and start telling stories. Stories of, a homeless girl in Indianapolis who, when we put in our Students in Action leadership training and public service program, went from getting all Fs to being the top student in her class, with her sights set on Florida State University and her own nonprofit. Those stories that just make you think about what we do is so significant, and it's one life at a time.
Mm-hmm. And so that's one way that you help everybody stay focused on what the real purpose is.
Yeah, there's nothing better than telling a great story, and sitting around and just feeling the visceral emotional impact of what you do. That helps you then say, okay, you know what, I can sort of steel myself and go ask the next person for money. I can find a way to make payroll next Thursday, right? All of those things that nonprofit leaders have to do, week in and week out.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can tell a story, and you've obviously figured out ways to tell it in a way that compels action and emotion. Are there any consistent frameworks that you use for the stories that you develop, or is it pretty much ad hoc?
It's more ad hoc than you think. I think that the thing that I always try to do is think about the things that make me tear up, but also think about who my audience is. So, I guess one of the big strengths I have coming from Wall Street is I think both in storytelling and in numbers. And so when you tell a story to somebody, you got to think about what they care about, right? So that young woman in Indianapolis that I just described, her passion, turns out at some point she'd learned to play the violin. And her passion, it was the one thing that gave her serenity in what was a totally chaotic life. So now anybody who's a donor or a potential donor of the Jefferson Awards Foundation who cares about the arts and music is going to care about Paige Jones. What I can then do with that person is I can tell the Paige Jones story, and I've got hundreds of Paige Jones stories in my back pocket that relate to different things that these kids care about that will connect with an existing passion of somebody that the person who I'm delivering it to. But then put it back in a bigger picture context of, I'm telling you this story, but we as the Jefferson Awards Foundation train 1,000 Paige Joneses a year. Kids like Paige Jones are generating $80 million of community impact thanks to being involved in our program. And so that ability to take an individual story and connect it into a much bigger picture of impact, I think is essential and it's really significant.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And in your transition from the corporate world to the business world, your first 2-3 years in your role here, we've all had some, I guess we could call them failures or we can call them learning experiences. Have you had any of those these first 2.5 years that you'd be willing to share? And could you also share what you learned from it?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is I've had so many. I think that one of the most significant things that I've learned is just has to do with the cash flow of a nonprofit. And the reality is while this is, we are revenue generative, for the most part, these are donor dollars. And so when you walk into a donor's office and you have them in your pipeline for delivering cash flow in May, and you're counting on that cash flow to make payroll, and that donor says, I'm invested in XYZ stocks, and I think that they're going to run through the rest of the year, so I will give you my donation in December. Those are tough moments as a nonprofit leader. And so I've learned to be much more conservative in terms of how I think about where my cash flow is going to come from and when, and to create structures around the organization so that we can withstand those moments. That's a big one. I think that, I've been really surprised by the unwillingness broadly around the nonprofit sector to create true and meaningful partnerships. I think probably because people feel like they're competing for donor dollars, and everybody has the same challenges around revenue, that people are unwilling to admit weaknesses and say, hey, we've got a hole in our organization here. You can help fill it with what you do. And so we've really had to reposition our thought process around national partnerships to think about, walking into every conversation of saying basically, here's what we can do for you in a way that is truly augmenting your ability to raise dollars as opposed to just assuming people are going to do the right thing for the right reasons. That's been probably my biggest disappointment in the nonprofit world. And, you just figure out how to deal around it. The other piece that I think is where I've certainly made mistakes is we have a lot of stakeholders, a lot of people who want us to do a lot of different things all the time. And it's really important as the executive director to sort of always keep your eye on the ball and just trust your own instincts. So when a significant board member comes to you and says, I think we should do this and I think we should do it this way, I certainly have made the mistake a number of times where I've said, you know what, I really trust this person. I think this person is terrific. My gut tells me differently, but I'm just going to follow it. And in every one of those cases, and it's not necessarily a board member, but any key constituent where I've really not listened to my own gut, in almost every case has ended up in something that I've needed to unravel. Whether that was in sort of key hires or bringing on various consultants, things like that, where my gut said don't do it, and I did it anyway. And they've it's created things that I've then needed to either redo or unravel.
Well, and I know that's an issue that a lot of executive directors struggle with, because on one hand, they feel like these stakeholders have a lot of influence and they're worried about either losing funding, losing the person as a volunteer, maybe getting fired as the executive director if it's a board member coming with this request. So how do you manage that?
I think that board management is sales just like anything else. And sales is all about understanding what somebody's needs are, understanding where they're coming from, making sure they feel as if they're heard, and that their considerations have really been taken into account. But then as the executive director, you're in the seat because they trust you to run the organization tactically and strategically. And so I think the most important thing is to really hear it, really have in-depth conversations when somebody has a passion around it. But if you disagree, you have to be willing to stand up and say, I've totally heard you. I agree with the whole that you suggest we have. This is the way that I feel more comfortable addressing it. And to have it be a partnership of conversation as opposed to either just blindly accepting it or pushing back in a way that alienates those key stakeholders.
Absolutely. And through your programs, you've mentioned this earlier, that one of the big goals is to empower, enable change to happen, and doing that through other people. What kind of things have you learned that work well, and maybe some things that don't work so well in that process?
I think the most significant thing is you have to make people feel comfortable in their own skin. If you want to really power somebody to help you or power somebody to do something significant that they want to do, it has to exist in the context of their own abilities and their own networks. It's certainly been a mistake, I think, that we've made as an organization where we say, all right, as an example, every board member should be able to raise money. If they just know the message, every board member should be able to pick up the phone and call anybody. The reality is that some people are really, really good at it and really comfortable at it, and others just aren't. And so the most significant thing that we focus on is understanding the key strengths and the key weaknesses of those that we're trying to activate, and really leveraging those things. And I think about it through our programs, right? In our programs, particularly our youth-oriented ones, we're training young people to figure out what they care about in the universe. If they already know, we're training them to figure out how to have maximum impact on those things. So inside our own organization, at the heart of what we do is we power others to have maximum measurable impact on the things they care about most. Inside that, again, it's all about them. Now there's sort of centralized skills that you can train people on, and that's at the heart of what we do. But when you add it all up, it's one individual at a time, understanding what their needs are, and how to build community around them.
Great, thank you. There's been a lot of conversation in the sector around leadership in the sector. Some people have gone as far to say as it's a crisis of leadership, a lack of leadership in the nonprofit sector. As we're looking at training up new leaders and bringing up new executive directors, we've got a bunch of boomers who are beginning to retire from their positions. So what are some of the things that you see we as a sector could do to better support and equip people who are coming into these roles?
I think a number of things. First of all, I think that the nonprofit sector, there is a whole debate that's going on, and I think there's a TED Talk that people always sort of point to around what should compensation be in the nonprofit world. We always think about who's going to give money to a nonprofit if your executive director makes too much money, or if your key staff make too much money. Now I think the nonprofit sector in general, sort of like teachers, sort of terminally underpay their people. It goes back into the category a little bit of we get what you pay for. Now that's a big structural thing that I think that people need to focus on, about sort of what is the right pay scale for paying people in the nonprofit world. What's the best way to leverage donor dollars in an effective way? I also think that a lot of times in the nonprofit world, you do feel very alone. For me, as I've been doing this now for sort of coming on 3 years, one of the best things I've done is build up a network of other nonprofit leaders who I really like, who I really respect. When I'm having a bad day, I can pick up the phone and call. And, really being able to formalize, I think, relationships between nonprofit leaders in a way that that creates a support mechanism that's honest. That's not about how am I going to raise the next dollar, but just that's about, what do you do on the days when your boards drive you nuts? What do you do on the days when, your big donors don't deliver and you got to figure out how to make payroll? How do you reposition the organization in such a way that you can really tell your message effectively? All of those things that we all face that are thematic. Having better support mechanisms and networks, I think, is totally crucial.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, too. It's one of the reasons I've started these nonprofit peer leadership groups that provide that forum in a more formal way. But certainly the informal support network is so important. And I've heard that same sentiment from others. So I know it's not just a one-time situation.
Yeah, and I also think that we all struggle with board engagement. What's the best way to engage your board? How do you separate strategic from tactical? How do you build a board? How do you go find people that really are gonna love what you do, who are willing to put their own personal networks on the line to help you, who are willing to reach into their pockets in a significant way to help drive the organization strategically? I think that those things are just so crucial and hard, the things that keep us all up in the middle of the night. I think probably nonprofit executives could also all use insomnia training because I have heard from everybody about the many, many sleepless nights, and I definitely didn't have any sleepless nights when I worked on Wall Street, but I sure have a lot now.
Oh. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there nodding their head at that. So as we close our conversation, and especially after talking about the insomnia training, do you have anything that you can share with our executive directors, words of encouragement, inspiration that might be helpful to them as they move forward?
Yeah, what I would say is, and it goes back to something we were talking about earlier. As nonprofit executives, we all have a lot of really hard days. Doing good in the world is so important, and it's so hard. On those days, think about who you know in your network, or even who you admire in the nonprofit space, who you might want to know, and pick up the phone. Because in general, I think those of us who experience these same challenges collectively would like to have peers and collaborators and friends where you can pick up the phone and say, oh my goodness, it's Thursday and I'm not exactly sure I'm going to how to make payroll on Friday. And to have that ear on the other side that understands in a really visceral way, has faced those same challenges and has maybe some ideas that you haven't thought of, is, I think, just invaluable. And on those days, remember, tell a story. Pick your favorite individual that your nonprofit has changed the life of, and tell yourself or tell somebody else that story. Because it'll remind you just how important it is, the work that we do.
What great advice. Thank you so much, Hillary, for joining me today. This has been a lot of fun.
Likewise, I loved it.
Great. And thank you to all our listeners for everything you do to make the world a better place.
Thanks for listening to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast with KIRSTEN Bullock. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll check out our prior episodes and that you'll pass along our web address, nonprofitleadersnetwork.com, to your friends and colleagues in the nonprofit sector.